Saipan, July 3rd, 1944. 0300 hours. Private First Class Guy Gabaldon lies flat against volcanic rock, 40 feet above a cave entrance, listening. Below him, maybe 30 Japanese soldiers are sleeping in shifts. He can hear them, low voices, coughing, the faint metallic sound of someone cleaning a rifle in the dark. The smell of smoke drifts upward through the humid Pacific air. Cooking fires, wet clothing, something else underneath it. The particular smell of men who have been hiding underground for days, rationing water, waiting for a death they believe is inevitable and honorable. Gabaldon has 2 grenades, 1 pistol, 38 rounds of ammunition. He has no radio, no backup, no orders authorizing what he is about to do. He is 18 years old, 5 feet 4 inches tall, a Mexican-American kid from the Boyle Heights neighborhood of East Los Angeles who learned Japanese on the streets of his own neighborhood from a family the United States government sent to an internment camp in Wyoming. In approximately 90 minutes, he will walk down to that cave entrance alone and attempt to convince every man inside to surrender. The Marine Corps does not teach this. No training manual covers it. No officer has authorized it. His company commander has already threatened him with court-martial twice this week for similar operations. Gabaldon does not care. He has been on Saipan for 23 days. In that time, he has personally captured more than 300 Japanese soldiers and civilians, more than most rifle companies achieve in an entire island campaign. He has done it alone at night, using broken Japanese and a psychological approach so unconventional that his superiors simultaneously want to punish him and cannot argue with the results. Tonight, the numbers he is hunting are different. Tonight, it is not 5 prisoners or 20. The intelligence reports he has managed to overhear suggest that somewhere between 800 and 1,000 combatants and civilians are sheltering in the cave network beneath bonsai cliffs on the island's northern coast. They have food for perhaps 4 more days. They have weapons, ammunition, and officers who have told them repeatedly and with absolute conviction that American Marines torture prisoners, execute the wounded, and sell Japanese skulls as trophies back home. They have also been told that surrender is cowardice of the worst kind, a permanent stain on their family's honor, an insult to the emperor, a spiritual failure that follows a man into the afterlife. American doctrine for situations like this is straightforward. Flamethrowers, demolition charges, seal the caves, move the front line forward. Efficient, brutal, final. The flamethrower teams are scheduled to arrive at 0900. Gabaldon has 6 hours. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand what Guy Gabaldon was attempting on that volcanic cliff top in the summer of 1944, you have to understand what Saipan meant, not just tactically but existentially, to both sides of the Pacific War. By the 3rd year of the conflict, the strategic map of the Pacific had been redrawn in blood and fire. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had projected power across nearly a third of the world's oceans in the months following Pearl Harbor, had been systematically dismantled by American industrial production and naval warfare on a scale history had rarely witnessed. The Battle of Midway in June of 1942 had destroyed 4 Japanese fleet carriers and their irreplaceable experienced air crews in a single catastrophic afternoon. The grinding attrition campaigns of Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands had consumed aircraft, ships, and trained aviators Japan could not replace. By early 1944, the Imperial Navy's surface fleet still existed on paper, but its capacity for offensive action had been fundamentally crippled. Saipan changed the calculation entirely. The island sits in the Mariana Chain, approximately 1,500 miles south of Tokyo. In 1944, that distance mattered enormously because the United States Army Air Forces had just begun deploying the B-29 Superfortress, a strategic bomber with a combat range of roughly 3,500 miles, capable of carrying 20,000 pounds of ordnance at altitudes that made it nearly immune to Japanese interceptors. Saipan, if captured, would place every major Japanese city within range of a continuous American bombing campaign. The home islands themselves would become a target. Japanese imperial headquarters understood this with perfect clarity. When American forces landed on Saipan on June 15, 1944, they were not simply invading another island. They were threatening the territorial integrity of Japan itself. The orders issued to the island's defenders reflected that understanding. General Yoshitsugu Saito, commanding the 32,000 Japanese troops on Saipan, told his men directly, "This island must be held at the cost of every life. There would be no evacuation, no strategic withdrawal, no surrender. The soldiers on Saipan would fight until the last man was dead, or the Americans were driven into the sea." For the American forces landing on those beaches, the resistance was immediate and catastrophic. The 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, along with the Army's 27th Infantry Division, hit the beaches under fire from artillery that had been pre-registered on the landing zones for months. In the first 20 minutes of the assault, the Marines took casualties at a rate that shocked even officers who had survived Guadalcanal and Tarawa. By the end of the first day, American forces had suffered 3,500 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing, without securing their initial objectives. The lagoon turned red. Landing craft burned on the reef line. Medical corpsmen ran out of plasma by mid-morning. Saipan was going to be different from any island the Americans had taken before, not because the terrain was impossible or the defenses were impenetrable, but because the Japanese defenders had made a collective psychological decision. They would not be taken prisoner. They would not retreat. They would fight in the caves and the sugarcane fields and the volcanic ridgelines until there was nothing left to fight with. And then they would use their last grenade on themselves. This was not rhetoric. It was policy. A policy enforced by officers who executed soldiers for suggesting retreat. A policy reinforced by propaganda so systematic and so relentless that it had become indistinguishable from belief. Guy Gabaldon understood something about belief. He had grown up in a neighborhood where belief was the most valuable currency available. Boyle Heights in the 1930s was one of the most ethnically diverse communities in Los Angeles. Mexican-American families, Japanese-American families, Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe, all compressed into a few square miles of rented houses and small shops east of the Los Angeles River. It was not a wealthy neighborhood. It was not a gentle neighborhood. But it was a neighborhood where a kid who paid attention could learn things no school would ever teach him. Gabaldon had started paying attention very early, because he had to. His home life was unstable enough that survival required reading people accurately, understanding what they actually meant rather than what they said, finding the spaces between anger and violence where a conversation could still change an outcome. When he was 12 years old, a Japanese-American family named Nakano effectively took him in. He ate at their table, accompanied their children to Japanese language school in the afternoons, absorbed not just vocabulary and grammar, but the deeper architecture of how Japanese people actually spoke to one another, the levels of formality, the implicit meanings, the specific phrases that conveyed respect or urgency or reassurance. He also absorbed something that would matter enormously on Saipan, the specific cultural weight of honor in Japanese military society, what it meant, how it functioned, and crucially, what it cost. When the Nakano family was sent to Heart Mountain Relocation Center in Wyoming in February of 1942, Gabaldon was 16 years old. He watched them go. He could not stop it. He could not explain it. He joined the Marine Corps on his 17th birthday, lie about his age on enlistment forms, a common practice among young men in those years who feared the war would end before they could reach it. The Marine Corps nearly rejected him for being too short. They did not. In the late summer of 1943, Private First Class Guy Gabaldon shipped out for the Pacific with the 2nd Marine Division. His service record noted his limited Japanese language proficiency. No one seems to have thought much about what to do with it. Gabaldon had other ideas. By the time the 2nd Marine Division landed on Saipan in June of 1944, the island had been under sustained naval bombardment for 3 days. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers had fired tens of thousands of shells into the island's defenses, and while the bombardment had been destructive, it failed to accomplish the goal that pre-invasion planners had hoped for. The Japanese defenders had spent months fortifying the island's natural cave systems, digging command posts and ammunition storage deep into the volcanic rock, where naval shells could not reach them. Sato's forces were hurt, but intact. The caves were full. The Americans landed anyway. 23 days of fighting followed. Grinding, brutal, meter-by-meter combat through sugarcane fields, across volcanic ridgelines, up cliff faces that provided perfect fields of fire for defenders and almost no cover for attackers. The Marines and soldiers of the 27th Infantry Division paid for every yard. The casualty figures, when they were finally compiled, would be staggering. More than 14,000 Americans killed or wounded on an island roughly 12 miles long and 5 miles wide. The Japanese paid even more. By the end of the third week of fighting, General Saito was dead, either killed in combat or by his own hand. The records are ambiguous, and the remaining Japanese forces have been compressed into the island's northern cliffs. Perhaps 3,000 soldiers and an unknown number of civilians remained alive. They had ammunition, they had weapons, and they had their orders. On the night of July 6, they launched the largest banzai charge of the entire Pacific War. More than 4,000 Japanese soldiers, some carrying only bamboo spears or knives lashed to poles, many already wounded, all of them fully understanding that they were not coming back, attacked American lines in a human wave that continued for hours. The 27th Infantry Division bore the brunt of it. 2 battalions were nearly destroyed. 406 American soldiers were killed in a single night. 512 more were wounded. It was the most costly single engagement of the Saipan campaign, and it accomplished almost nothing militarily. By dawn on July 7th, the bodies of the attackers stretched for hundreds of yards across the American lines. The charge was over. The survivors had retreated to the caves. And that is where Gabaldon found himself, on a volcanic clifftop at 3 a.m, listening. He had already done this before on a smaller scale, and the story of how it started explains everything about the man. His first night on Saipan, Gabaldon had slipped out of his unit's perimeter without authorization and walked into Japanese-held territory alone. He found 2 soldiers separated from their unit, approached them in the darkness, and spoke to them in Japanese. His accent was thick, East Los Angeles grammar school, mixed with whatever formal structures in the Kano family had taught him, but it was real Japanese, not textbook Japanese, not code sheet Japanese, street Japanese, the kind that sounds like a person rather than a phrase book. He told them they were surrounded. He told them that American prisoners received food and medical care. He told them their families would be notified they had survived. He walked them back to American lines. His company commander, Captain John Schwab, threatened him with court-martial. Gabaldon went out the next night anyway. He found a cave with guard posted outside, shot the guard, moved to the side of the entrance to avoid the line of fire if anyone inside decided to shoot back, and called into the darkness in Japanese. He told the soldiers inside that they were surrounded, that their officer had already been captured, that surrender meant survival. He stood in the dark outside that cave entrance for several minutes, alone, waiting. 50 Japanese soldiers walked out. Schwab stopped threatening court-martial. He started calling Gabaldon his lone wolf operator and trying to figure out how to put what this teenager was doing into some kind of official framework that the Marine Corps could process. There was no framework. Gabaldon was operating on pure instinct, cultural knowledge, and a psychological insight that most trained intelligence officers would have dismissed as naive, that a significant portion of the men in those caves did not actually want to die. They had been told they had to die. That was different. Over the next 3 weeks, he had brought in more than 300 prisoners. Small operations, careful approaches, always alone, always at night, always using the same fundamental argument. You were told the Americans would kill you, but here I am, and I have not killed anyone who surrendered to me. The men I have taken are alive. You could be alive too, but the clock is running, and the flamethrowers do not negotiate. 300 prisoners. No other Marine on Saipan was close. But the caves below Bonsai Cliff were different. The numbers were different. The density of armed soldiers was different. And the date was different, because by July 8, 1944, the American command was done waiting. The order had come down to clear the northern cliffs by 0900. Every cave, every position, no exceptions. Gabaldon lay on a volcanic rock in the pre-dawn darkness and made his calculations. 800 people, perhaps 1,000, were below him. If the flamethrower teams arrived on schedule, they would all be dead by noon. He had 6 hours. He started moving at 0330, picking his way down the cliff face in darkness, one hand always on the rock, testing each foothold before committing his weight. The volcanic stone was sharp-edged and irregular. The kind of terrain that punishes carelessness with a turned ankle or a 15-foot fall. Below him, the cave entrances were dark gaps in the cliff face, invisible except when someone inside shifted position, and a fragment of firelight escaped into the night air. He could smell them. The smell of a large group of people living underground in a tropical climate. Unwashed clothing, infection, the particular sweetness of wounds that have not been properly treated, the smoke of small cooking fires built from whatever combustible material was available, the smell of people who have been surviving for weeks in conditions that were killing them slowly and who have been told that this slow dying is preferable to the alternative. Gabaldon moved to a position above the largest cave entrance and settled in to wait for first light. At 0545, the sky above the Pacific began to change. The flat black of the overnight hours shifted gradually to a deep blue, then to a gray that was neither night nor morning. The particular light of Pacific dawns that seems to come from everywhere at once rather than from a single point on the horizon. Gabaldon could see the cave entrance clearly now. 2 soldiers sat outside it, both awake, both armed. Standard positioning, the same pattern he had observed at every significant cave on the island. Enough visibility to detect an approaching American patrol. Not enough to detect one man moving carefully between rocks. He observed them for 11 minutes. One was young. Gabaldon estimated 19, perhaps 20, with the hollow look of a man who had not eaten a full meal in several days. He was smoking, and his hands were not steady. The other was older, more deliberate in his movements, cleaning his rifle with the mechanical attention of a man trying to get himself something to focus on. Both of them had survived the bonsai charge 3 nights earlier. Both of them had retreated to this cave, knowing what came next. Gabaldon stood up and walked toward them. The soldiers saw him immediately. Both weapons came up. The older one had his rifle aimed center mass from a distance of roughly 12 feet. His finger was on the trigger. At that range, he could not miss. Gabaldon kept moving. He kept his hands partially visible, his posture as non-threatening as a man walking into rifle sights could manage. And he started talking. He told them in Japanese that American Marines were positioned in the rocks above with machine guns and flamethrower teams. He told them their officer had already surrendered and had ordered them to do the same. He told them the American fleet offshore had enough naval artillery to collapse every cave on the cliff face into rubble, and that the order to fire had not yet been given, but that it would be given within the hour unless the people in the caves came out. He was lying about most of this. There were no Marines in the rocks above. There was no officer who had ordered anything. The fleet offshore was real. The assembled might of the American Fifth Fleet, hundreds of ships visible from any point on the northern cliffs, but no specific fire order for this location had been issued. The flamethrower teams were real. That part was true. The soldier with the rifle hesitated. In the grammar of close quarters combat, that hesitation was everything. Gabaldon had learned something in 3 weeks of cave operations. The moment between a man's impulse to fire and his actual decision to pull the trigger is the space where everything happens. Fill that space with something. Words, motion, surprise, anything that forces a man to think rather than react. And the moment passes. Once it passes, the psychological momentum shifts. It is very hard to decide to kill someone who is still talking to you in your own language. He kept talking. He told them what American prisoner of war processing looked like. Food distribution, medical treatment. The notification procedure that informed families their soldiers were alive. He told them they would be returned to Japan after the war. He told them their families would know they had survived. The rifle came down slowly. He told them to set their weapons on the ground. The younger soldier dropped a cigarette. Both rifles were placed on the volcanic rock. Gabaldon was now holding 2 prisoners and needed approximately 800 more. He explained what he needed. One of them would go back into the cave, find whoever was in command, and report that an American intelligence officer was outside offering terms, that surrender was possible, that the alternative was naval bombardment followed by flamethrowers, that the decision needed to be made immediately. The younger soldier shook his head. He explained in fragmented sentences that Gabaldon had to work to parse, that the civilians inside had already prepared for suicide, that the wounded soldiers deeper in the cave had armed grenades, that walking back inside and suggesting surrender was not a neutral act. It was the kind of thing that could get a man shot by his own comrades. Gabaldon acknowledged the risk. He promised the soldier he would be safe, that he personally would ensure his protection. He did not mention that he was a private first class with no authority to promise anything to anyone, that his company commander did not know where he was, that the entire operation existed entirely outside any chain of command. The younger soldier looked at his companion. He looked at Gabaldon. He looked at the cave entrance. Then he walked into the darkness. Gabaldon waited. He sat on a volcanic rock beside the remaining prisoner and waited while the sun climbed above the Pacific horizon and the temperature began its rapid climb toward the brutal midday heat that made Saipan in July feel like the interior of a furnace. 5 minutes. 10. 15. From inside the cave, voices, arguing, urgent, sometimes sharp with what sounded like anger. 20 minutes. Then footsteps. Not one set of footsteps. Many. 12 Japanese soldiers walked out of the cave entrance. All of them were armed. 2 carried grenades on their belts. They spread into a rough line and stood looking at Gabaldon with expressions that were somewhere between assessment and disbelief. He was alone. He was 5 feet 4 inches tall. He was wearing a Marine Corps uniform that had not been washed in at least a week. His Japanese accent was, by any objective measure, terrible. Nothing about his physical presence communicated the overwhelming American military power he had been describing. What he actually looked like was a teenager who had gotten spectacularly lost. He did not let them think about that. He started talking immediately. The same practiced overlay of truth and fabrication he had been developing for 3 weeks. Marine Intelligence Unit. Commanding officer had sent him specifically because Japanese prisoners had reported civilians trapped in these caves, and American command did not want civilian casualties. Artillery crews were waiting for orders that had not yet been given, but the window was closing. The time for a decision was now. Among the 12 soldiers was an officer. Gabaldon could tell from the deference of the others, the slight adjustments in posture, the way eyes moved toward him when Gabaldon spoke. The officer's uniform was filthy and bloodstained, his left arm bandaged with cloth that had not been wiped for several days. He had been wounded in the Banzai charge and had survived it. He looked at the 2 guards Gabaldon had captured and studied it with the focused attention of a man conducting a field assessment, noting that they were unharmed, that they were not restrained, that they were standing rather than kneeling. He asked them in Japanese if the American had hurt them. Both guards shook their heads. Gabaldon seized a moment. He told the officer directly that American intelligence had intercepted Japanese military communications, that the order from Tokyo, 7 American kills per soldier before death, was condemning thousands of civilians to die for a military objective that had already been lost. Saipan was gone. The Imperial Navy had been destroyed in the Philippine Sea 6 days earlier in an engagement. American pilots were already calling the Marianas Turkey Shoot. No reinforcement was coming. No rescue fleet was approaching. The island was gone, and dying in a cave would not change that. The officer's expression did not shift, but his jaw tightened in particular way of a man hearing an argument he cannot refute. Gabaldon pointed toward the water. He told the officer to look at the American fleet. The officer walked the cliff edge and looked. The assembled force of the American Fifth Fleet was visible from the northern cliffs in its entirety. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transport ships, the full industrial weight of a nation that had been building warships at a pace that defied comprehension. One American shipyard had launched a destroyer escort every 10 days throughout 1943. The fleet that had brought the Saipan invasion force to Marianas was not a collection of individual vessels. It was a floating city. The officer stood at the cliff edge for a long time. When he turned back, something in his face had changed. Not surrender, not yet, but the particular look of a man who had been carrying a belief that reality has just finished dismantling. He asked about the civilians, the women and children, the elderly who could not walk, the wounded who could not be moved. What would happen to them? Gabaldon told him. Medical treatment, food, water, safe transport to internment facilities, repatriation to Japan after the war. American military law prohibited harming civilians who surrendered. He had no authority to promise any of this. He was the lowest-ranked combat soldier in the United States Marine Corps, but he delivered it with the absolute certainty of a man who has decided that conviction, in this moment, matters more than rank. The officer asked about his soldiers, the men who had fought, What would happen to them? Treatment as prisoners of war under international law. No torture. No executions. Medical care for the wounded. American forces on Saipan had already processed nearly 1,000 Japanese prisoners. Most were alive and receiving treatment. This, unlike much of what Gabaldon had said that morning, was true. The officer looked at his 12 men. He looked back at Gabaldon. He looked at the cave entrance. He bowed slightly and spoke in formal Japanese. He needed 30 minutes to discuss terms with the civilians and soldiers inside. Then he walked back into the cave. All 12 soldiers followed him. Gabaldon stood outside with the 2 original prisoners and the rising Pacific sun, and the knowledge that in 30 minutes he would either have accomplished something no individual Marine had ever done, or the officer would emerge with an entirely different kind of decision. The voices from inside the cave were immediate and audible, not calm deliberation. Argument. Raised voices that echoed off volcanic rock, urgent and unresolved. A man's voice cutting through others with command authority. A woman's voice, high and frightened. Something that might have been crying. The 2 guards beside Gabaldon listened without expression to a debate that both of them had already resolved for themselves. Gabaldon checked his watch. 07:58. 32 minutes since the officer had gone back inside. 2 minutes past the promised time. The voices inside the cave had gone quiet. That silence was worse. Then footsteps. Not one person. Not 12. Many. Moving faster than the first group, with an urgency that was different from anything he had heard so far. Not the measured pace of soldiers walking into an uncertain situation, but the sound of a crowd that has made a decision and is moving before the decision can be reconsidered. The officer emerged first. Behind him, an elderly man in civilian clothing, then a woman carrying an infant, then 2 more women, then wounded soldiers. One missing his left hand, the stump wrapped in strips of torn uniform, then 5 people together, then 10, then a steady, continuous stream of human beings walking out of a cave into morning sunlight, blinking against the brightness of a world they had not seen for days. Gabaldon started counting. 30, 40, 50. They kept coming. A woman supported an elderly man who could barely place one foot in front of the other. 3 children walked hand in hand behind their mother, none of them older than 10, all of them silent with the particular stillness of children who have learned that sound attracts danger. A soldier on an improvised stretcher, carried by 2 others who were themselves barely capable of walking, with burns covering half his face from what looked like a flamethrower encounter earlier in the campaign. 60, 70, 80. The 2 guards he had captured were helping now, organizing the civilians into groups, separating the wounded who needed immediate medical attention. No one had instructed them to do this. They simply began doing it, because the alternative, standing still while the situation expanded beyond anyone's capacity to manage it, was less acceptable than being useful. 100, 120, 150. Gabaldon had never handled anything close to this. His record was 50. This was already triple that, and they were still coming. He was one Marine with a pistol trying to maintain order over a crowd that was growing by the minute, a crowd that included armed soldiers, and the arithmetic of that situation was not comfortable to calculate. If 10% of the soldiers decided to rush him, he was dead. If panic spread to the civilians, the entire operation collapsed. If someone deep in the cave changed their mind and rolled a grenade toward the entrance, the people packed near the opening would be killed. 200, 250, 300. The officer caught his eye and told him the number still inside. 500 more, perhaps 600. Soldiers deeper in the cave system were still arguing. Some had armed grenades. Some were insisting on collective suicide rather than surrender, invoking the same code that had sent 4,000 men into Banzai Charge 3 nights before. The officer had convinced the civilians and the wounded. The combat soldiers deeper in the system were a different problem. Gabaldon looked at his watch. 0837. 23 minutes until the flamethrower teams were scheduled to arrive. He made a decision that could cost him everything. He told the officer to select 10 of the soldiers who had already surrendered, men with visible wounds, men whose survival in American custody was physically evident, and take them back into the cave. Show the holdouts. Make the argument not with words, but with the bodies of men who had surrendered and had not been executed. let them see their own people alive, unharmed, standing in the morning sunlight. Then he turned to one of the original guards. He told him to run to American lines, find medical corpsmen, bring them back with supplies, food, water, bandages, morphine. Bring them now. The guard hesitated. Running toward American lines meant crossing open ground, alone, in a combat zone where any Marine who saw him would have approximately 1 second to decide whether the Japanese soldier waving a white cloth was a prisoner or a threat. Gabaldon handed him a strip of white cloth torn from a Japanese uniform. He told him to wave it, to shout in English that he was carrying a message from Private Gabaldon, that there were 300 prisoners who needed medical attention immediately. The guard took the cloth. He looked at Gabaldon. He ran. Gabaldon watched him disappear over the ridge and turned back to the crowd in front of him, 300 people sitting on volcanic rock in the growing heat of a Pacific morning, waiting to find out whether the promises of one teenage Marine from East Los Angeles were worth the risk they had taken to believe them. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The 30 minutes that followed were the longest of Gabaldon's war. He could hear the argument still happening in the cave, the officer's voice reasoning, other voices resisting, the sound of someone crying again deeper inside, where the acoustic properties of the volcanic tunnels turned individual voices into something shapeless and collective. Outside, 300 people sat in the morning heat and waited, and Gabaldon stood in the middle of them with a pistol and 38 rounds of ammunition, and the specific, focused calm of a man who is committed entirely to a course of action and has no option left but to see it through. The woman with the infant was trying to nurse her child, but her hands were shaking too badly. An elderly man near the cave entrance was praying quietly, Buddhist prayers, the kind Gabaldon had heard in the Kano household when he was 12 years old, words asking ancestors for forgiveness, promising explanation in whatever came after this life. The old man was apologizing for choosing to live. 5 minutes. 8. 12. Then the sound changed. The arguing stopped. What replaced it was movement. Not the careful, deliberate footsteps of the first groups, but a crowd in motion. People moving together. Urgently. The way a crowd moves when it has finally resolved something and is acting before the resolution can dissolve. 350. 400. The flow from the cave entrance became continuous. Soldiers carrying wounded comrades on their backs. Children holding their mothers' hands. Old men supporting each other across the sharp volcanic rock. All of them moving with the particular urgency of people who have spent the last hour deciding whether to live and have come out on the correct side of that decision. 450. 500. On the ridge above the cliff. 3 figures in white medical uniforms appeared, running. The guard had made it. The corpsmen had their supplies and were moving toward the prisoner group at a run, which meant that the Japanese prisoners watching from below could see American medical personnel coming toward them, not away from them, coming to treat them, coming to make good on the promises Gabaldon had made. The flow from the cave became a flood. 550. 600. 650. 700. Families staying together. Soldiers helping soldiers. The distinction between military and civilian had dissolved into something simpler. People who had chosen to live, moving together to a morning that none of them had been certain they would see. 750. 790. 800. The officer stood beside Gabaldon and told him that was everyone. Every living person in those caves had come out. No one had committed suicide. No one had fought. Gabaldon stood in the middle of 800 Japanese soldiers and civilians. All of them surrendered, all of them alive, and the medical corpsmen were already moving to the crowd, kneeling beside the wounded, opening supplies, doing the work that corpsmen do. Then he heard engines, heavy engines, coming from the American lines. The flamethrower teams had arrived, early as it happened, because somewhere in the chain of command, someone had decided not to wait for 0900. 3 M4 Sherman tanks rolled into position above the caves. Behind them, 2 trucks carrying 12 Marines in protective gear with enough ordnance to turn every cave on the cliff face into a crematorium. Gabaldon ran toward them, waving both arms, shouting that the caves were clear, that everyone had surrendered, that they needed to hold fire. The lead tank commander saw him, saw the 800 Japanese behind him, saw the medical corpsmen working. The scene made no operational sense. His orders were to seal caves with flamethrowers and demolition charges. There was no provision in those orders for finding a private first class running what appeared to be an impromptu prisoner processing station in the middle of a combat zone. The commander climbed down from his tank. He asked Gabaldon what in God's name was happening. Gabaldon gave him the short version. 800 prisoners. Captured in the last 90 minutes. Caves empty. Flamethrowers not needed. What he needed now was transport, guards, medical support, and someone with actual authority to take command of a situation that was currently being managed by a man whose rank entitled him to approximately no authority whatsoever. The tank commander stared at the crowd. He did a rough head count. He looked back at Gabaldon. He sent a squad into the caves to verify. They returned 20 minutes later. The caves were empty, weapons abandoned, medical supplies left behind, food stores untouched, 300 yards of volcanic tunnels, deserted. Every person who had been inside was sitting on the rock outside in the Pacific morning sun. Everything Gabaldon had said was true. Word moved through the American lines quickly. Within an hour, Captain John Schwab arrived with a company of Marines. The same officer who had twice threatened Gabaldon with court-martial in the preceding 3 weeks. The same officer who had reluctantly authorized his lone wolf operations after the 50-prisoner success. The same officer who had watched his company's prisoner count climb past 300 through the efforts of one soldier who kept ignoring orders. Schwab looked at the 800 prisoners. He looked at Gabaldon. He asked for an explanation. Gabaldon gave him the same short version he had given the tank commander. Found 2 guards. Captured them. Sent one back inside. Officer emerged with 12 armed soldiers. Convinced the officer that surrender was the only viable option. Sent a guard for medical support to demonstrate that American promises were real. Officer returned inside with proof. Everyone surrendered. 800 total. Schwab asked how many Marines Gabaldon had brought with him. Gabaldon said none. Schwab was silent for a long time. Then he said that he was recommending Gabaldon for the Medal of Honor, that what happened on this cliff in the previous 90 minutes was beyond anything he had witnessed in 30 years of military service. That capturing 800 enemy personnel without firing a single shot deserved the highest recognition the United States Marine Corps could confer. Gabaldon did not yet know what that recommendation would become. He was focused on getting 800 people safely onto the transport trucks that were beginning to arrive below the cliffs. The officer who had walked back into the cave with 10 living witnesses approached Gabaldon as the loading began. He bowed formally, the full bow of someone expressing genuine obligation rather than mere courtesy, and thanked him in Japanese for keeping his promises, for the medical care, for the food, for treating people who had been enemies an hour ago as something other than enemies now. Gabaldon returned the bow. He told the officer he hoped they both survived the war, that maybe someday they would meet in peacetime. The officer smiled slightly. He told Gabaldon he would not forget the 5'4" Marine who spoke terrible Japanese and saved his life. By 1400 hours, all 800 prisoners were in American custody. The caves were empty. The flamethrower teams were standing down. Saipan would be declared secure the following day. But Gabaldon's war was not over, and the story of what happened next, the campaign that would push his prisoner total past 1,000, the wound that ended his fighting, and the recognition that was given and then quietly taken away. That is where the deeper reckoning of the story begins. The island of Tinian lies 3 miles southwest of Saipan, close enough that from the northern cliffs, a man with good eyes could see its flat sugarcane field stretching to a horizon that offered no cover and nowhere to hide. American planners had selected it as the next objective for reasons that were almost entirely strategic. Tinian's flat terrain made it ideal for airfield construction on the scale required to base be 29 operations against the Japanese home islands. 6 days after Saipan was declared secure, the Marines landed. Gabaldon went with them. The 2nd Marine Division crossed from Saipan to Tinian on July 24, 1944. The invasion force landed on beaches that Japanese commanders had calculated were too narrow for a major assault. a miscalculation that proved catastrophic for the defenders and allowed American forces to establish a beachhead before the weight of the island's defenses could be brought to bear. Within 9 days, the main Japanese defensive line had collapsed. The surviving defenders, approximately 9,000 troops under Vice Admiral Kakuji Kakuta, retreated the island's southern cliffs and cave systems in a pattern that mirrored, almost exactly, what Gabaldon had encountered at Saipan's northern coast. Different island, same problem. Tinian's terrain was different from Saipan's, flatter, more open, with fewer of the deep volcanic cave systems that had sheltered large numbers of defenders. The Japanese positions were more dispersed, smaller groups in shallower cover, which in some ways made Gabaldon's approach more feasible and in other ways more dangerous. Fewer people per location meant more locations to visit, more individual approaches, more separate negotiations in a combat environment that was still active and unpredictable. He worked the same way he had worked on Saipan, alone at night or in the early pre-dawn hours, moving between Japanese positions, using his Japanese language capability and a particular combination of truth and strategic misdirection to open conversations that should not have been possible. 5 prisoners here, 12 there. A position that would have required an air strike or sustained assault by a rifle platoon instead yielded 22 people walking out with their hands visible because a teenager from East Los Angeles had spent 40 minutes persuading a Japanese sergeant that the mathematics of the situation had already been resolved. His total climbed past 900, past 1,000. By the time Tinian was declared secure on August 1st, 1944, Gabaldon had captured more than 1,300 enemy troops and civilians across both islands. The figure that various accounts would eventually settle on, often cited as more than 1,500 when including subsequent mopping-up operations, made him the single most productive individual prisoner-taker in the history of the United States military. The cost arrived in early 1945. Saipan had been declared secure, but the island was not empty. Japanese holdouts remained in the interior, small groups, sometimes individual soldiers, men who had not received word of the island's fall, or who had received it and refused to believe it, or who had believed it and were waiting for a rescue they had been promised would come. They continued fighting in the jungle and in the remaining cave systems with the mechanical persistence of men who had been trained to a single purpose and had no framework for reconsidering it. Gabaldon was hunting one of these groups when he walked into an ambush. 3 Japanese soldiers, hidden in dense jungle terrain, had positioned themselves to cover an approach route they had observed being used by American patrols. Gabaldon never saw them. They opened fire at close range. Multiple rifle rounds struck his right arm. The wound shattered bone and severed nerve tissue. Blood loss was immediate and severe. Marines in his patrol returned fire and killed all 3 Japanese soldiers. They got Gabaldon to a medical evacuation point. Field surgeons stabilized him, and he was transferred to a hospital ship, then to Pearl Harbor, then to California. His war was over at 19 years old. The Marine Corps awarded him the Silver Star in late 1944. The citation acknowledged his extraordinary courage and initiative, specifically mentioned the 800-prisoner operation at Bonsai Cliffs, and noted his total of over 1,000 captures across the campaign. The language was precise and controlled and said, between its carefully chosen words, that what Gabaldon had accomplished was something for which the existing framework of military commendation was not entirely adequate. Captain Schwab's Medal of Honor recommendation had been downgraded. The official reason was never clearly stated in any document that has since been declassified. Some historians have pointed to Gabaldon's repeated violations of operational procedure, his unauthorized departures from his unit's perimeter, his solo operations conducted entirely outside the chain of command. Some have noted that his methods could not be replicated or incorporated into standard doctrine, which created an institutional awkwardness around recognizing them as the highest expression of military valor. Some have said, more plainly, what the records only imply, that in 1944, the Medal of Honor was not something the Marine Corps was prepared to award to a Mexican-American private who had succeeded by doing the opposite of what he had been told. Gabaldon suspected it was all 3. In 1960, after years of advocacy by veterans organizations and Latino civil rights groups, the Silver Star was upgraded to the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration the Navy and Marine Corps award, one level below the medal that Schwab had recommended and that the record, by any reasonable accounting, justified. Secretary of the Navy William Frank presented it personally. The citation acknowledged Gabaldon's capture of well over 1,000 troops and civilians, and noted that his actions had saved American lives by preventing costly assaults on fortified positions. The Medal of Honor remained out of reach. Gabaldon returned to civilian life in the years after his discharge and took a path that did not move in a straight line toward the kind of comfortable veterans narrative that American culture tends to prefer. He spent several years in Mexico. He returned to Saipan in 1970 and stayed for 2 decades, working with local communities, helping veterans on both sides of the conflict navigate the long aftermath of a war that had physically reshaped the island he had fought on. In 1960, a Hollywood film called Hell to Eternity dramatized the story. The studio cast Jeffrey Hunter, 6 feet tall, blue-eyed, the physical opposite of the man being portrayed, to play the 5'4" Mexican-American kid from East Los Angeles. The film never mentioned Gabaldon's ethnicity. It never showed the Nakano family. It never explained where the Japanese language came from or what it had cost the people who taught it to him. Guy Gabaldon watched the film and saw himself erased from his own story. He said very little about it publicly. He understood, with a particular clarity of someone who has spent his life operating in the spaces between what people say and what they mean, exactly what had happened and exactly why. The 800 people who walked out of the caves at Bonsai Cliffs on July 8, 1944, did not forget. Some of them survived the war, returned to Japan, and in the years that followed told their families about the small Marine who had spoken broken Japanese from outside a cave entrance and promised them they would see home again. Some of those families, decades later, found ways to express the obligation they felt toward a man most of them had never met, the obligation of the living toward whoever made it possible for them to live. Gabaldon moved to Florida in 2003. He was 77 years old, and his health was failing. Heart disease, the cumulative weight of the wound damage from the Saipan ambush, the particular deterioration that comes from a body that was asked to do too much too young and never entirely recovered from the asking. He died on August 31st, 2006, at 80 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. His Medal of Honor application, which various advocacy efforts had kept alive through decades of official review and sympathetic congressional attention, was still pending. It remains pending today. The question that Gabaldon's story forces into the open is not a comfortable one, and it does not have a clean answer. During the Second World War, the Medal of Honor was awarded to 464 service members across all branches of the American military. The majority of those awards recognized acts of extraordinary offensive valor, charging defended positions, throwing oneself on grenades to save fellow soldiers, holding ground against attacks that should have been unsurvivable. These were genuine acts of courage, real sacrifices, fully deserving of the recognition they received. The criteria for the medal, as established by Congress, require that the action be performed in the presence of the enemy, and that it reflect extraordinary valor above and beyond the call of duty. Guy Gabaldon performed his actions in the presence of several hundred armed enemies. He operated under conditions that would have constituted a death sentence for most men. He accomplished results that no rifle company, no artillery barrage, no airstrike could replicate. Results measured not in positions taken or enemies killed, but in lives preserved on both sides of the line. The official position has been consistent. His methods were unconventional. His operations were unauthorized. His success could not be standardized. The unofficial truth, which the record supports without quite stating it directly, is simpler. He looked different. He fought differently. He came from the wrong neighborhood, spoke the wrong language for the wrong reasons, owed his most essential skill to a family that the United States government had imprisoned without charge in a Wyoming relocation center while he was using what they had taught him to save American lives. That tension between what the country was and what it claimed to be, between the service it demanded and the recognition it was prepared to offer, is the deeper history that Gabaldon's story carries. The Marine Corps uses his methods today, his approach to psychological operations, the specific techniques he developed through 3 weeks of solo cave work on Saipan and Tinian are studied at officer training courses and cited in unconventional warfare doctrine. The intellectual property of his courage has been incorporated and formalized and taught to generations of military officers who may not know his name. His name, meanwhile, is not where it should be. It is not in the same sentence as Audie Murphy, who received the Medal of Honor for killing an extraordinary number of German soldiers in France in January of 1945, and who deserved every recognition he received. It is not in the same sentence as John Basilone, who held a Marine line on Guadalcanal against a banzai attack with a water-cooled machine gun, and whose face appeared on war bond posters. It is not in the standard list of names American school children are taught when they learn about the individual courage of the Second World War. It should be, Guy Gabaldon walked down a volcanic cliff face in the pre-dawn darkness with a pistol and 38 rounds of ammunition and the broken Japanese he had learned from a family that America had imprisoned, and he convinced 800 human beings to choose life over the death they had been trained to prefer. He did this for the same reason he had done it the night before, and the night before that, and the night before that. Not because anyone told him to, not because the chain of command authorized it, but because he understood something about people that the Marine Corps had never taught him and that no training manual had ever contained. He understood that most people, given a real choice, choose to live. That the gap between what they've been told and what is actually true is a space that one person, at the right moment with the right words, can step into and change everything. He did that 800 times in a single morning, more than 1,000 times across an island campaign that was still taking American lives. The recognition that should have followed that did not come as its own kind of history, the history of what a nation decides to honor and what it decides to quietly set aside, and what those decisions say about the distance between the values it claims and the ones it actually holds. Gabaldon's name should be as known as any name in the American military tradition. The story of what he did on Saipan should be as familiar as the story of any man who charged a machine gun nest or threw himself on a grenade. Both kinds of courage are real. Both kinds matter. But only one kind, the kind that looked like him, that sounded like him, that came from where he came from and fought the way he fought, waited 60 years for recognition it still has not fully received. That is the story of Guy Gabaldon. That is the story worth knowing. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.